watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
In asking the question of whether Israel will survive, and by that, of course, I mean, will it survive as both a Jewish and a democratic state, it's important that we squarely take stock of all the reasons why Israel's existence, almost uniquely among all the countries of the world, is seriously in jeopardy. So I'm going to skip over some of the second-tier problems like Israel's endemic political corruption and its borderline dysfunctional parliamentary system to focus on what seem to me to be the four central threats. Two of them are internal and two are external. First of all, demography. In 1955, Jews accounted for a little less than 90% of the population of Israel, while Muslims accounted for 8.8%. Today, the Muslim proportion of the population has nearly doubled to 15.9%, while the Jewish share has fallen to 75%. 1 in 4 Israelis under the age of 19 is Muslim. In absolute numbers, that makes for a Muslim population of about 1.1 million out of a total of 7.4 million. Now add the Arabs of the West Bank, that is, Palestinians living entirely within the borders of Israel, but excluding the people of Gaza. In doing so, you increase the Muslim total by 2 million, which brings the current Muslim population living within Israel to 3.1 million out of 9.4 million. That is a little less than a third. But that picture is likely to deteriorate for two main reasons. The first is that while Jewish Israelis are among the very few people in the Western world with a positive birth rate, they cannot compete with Muslim Israeli women who deliver roughly 3 babies for every 2 a Jewish mother does. The exact birth rate among Palestinians in the West Bank is disputed, but it is almost certainly higher than the Israeli Arab figure. The second reason is that the last great well of Aliyah may well have dried up. The last Aliyah, the last major Aliyah, was from the Soviet Union, and it brought about 1 million people or more to the state, and it went far to extend Israel's demographic lease on life by a generation or so. But aside from the sporadic and relatively small-scale Aliyah, such as the one from Argentina in the first years of this decade, it's hard to see where the next great wave of immigrants might come from, except perhaps from Europe. But even there, conditions would have to worsen sharply and rapidly to prompt large-scale Jewish immigration, meaning, in other words, that such aliyah could only be the product of a dreadful crisis in the European half of the Western world, and nothing that any one of us should welcome. Now, the second threat, as I see it, to Israel's existence is the question of Zionism. An estimated 650,000 Israeli citizens, roughly the population, or certainly the Jewish population of Jerusalem or metropolitan Tel Aviv, reside outside of Israel, most of them here in this country. That's about 1 in 9 Jewish Israelis. They are among the best educated and wealthiest Israelis. That's the human capital countries need in order to flourish, and one could argue that their living abroad is tantamount to a vote of no confidence in the Jewish state. Then there are the ultra-Orthodox who are happy to suck on the teat of Israel's welfare state while refusing to participate in many of its most basic obligations, military service above all, and whose views of Zionism have wavered between ambivalence, indifference, and hostility. The Israeli Census Bureau counts the Haredi population at 8% of the Israeli Jewish population, but the number is almost certainly higher due to their very high birth rate. How high? Today, 23% of all first graders in Israel are ultra-Orthodox. In Jerusalem, the Haredim are fully a quarter of the city's 800,000 residents, east and west, which means that what you might call the Zionist population of what Israeli politicians are fond of calling the united and eternal capital of the state of Israel, the Zionist population of Jerusalem is in the minority. Meanwhile, I read recently that only half of all Israelis under the age of 18 have ever bothered to visit Jerusalem, which is nowhere more than a 3-hour drive from wherever they might live. Here's another detail. In 2007, according to an IDF, an Israeli Defense Force report, 27.7% of all Israeli males of conscription age were not inducted into the army. That figure already excludes Israeli Arabs, most of whom do not serve. Now, of those nearly 28%, a little more than a third were exempted because they are yeshiva students, a quarter on account of medical deferments, and about a fifth on account of past criminal records. The rest were living abroad. Among Israeli women, the deferment rate was considerably higher, again, mostly on account of religious exemptions. Why does this matter? Because the army is the one institution in Israel that shepherds a massively diverse society through a single experience, a single organization, and imprints a common identity and set of Zionist values on them. Then there is Zionist decay among secular Israelis, and this takes two forms. The first is an aggressive ideological assault on the moral bases of Zionism, typically coming from a small group of Israeli academics and intellectuals with outsized followings abroad, but also an influential domestic constituency, particularly among university and high school educators. The second is a combination of indifference and confusion among much of the secular public about the history, nature, and purpose of Zionism. Part of that is explained by the mass immigration of secular Jews from Russia, for whom Israel was merely a destination of convenience, but much of it is simply a function of neglect and ignorance within mainstream Israeli society itself. Finally, there is evidence of Zionist decline in the Jewish diaspora. Here the evidence is probably more anecdotal than statistical, but you can see it in the creation of groups like J Street, and particularly on college campuses, where Jewish kids are often at the forefront of pro-Palestinian solidarity campaigns and that sort of thing. And the problem here is that a lot of young Jews feel that support for Israel has somehow become a right-wing cause, never mind that Israel is the only country in the Middle East where progressive values and positions like gay rights, women's rights, the rights of minorities, the rights of the accused, the rights of cultural expression, and above all, the rights of disagreement and dissent have been vigorously protected and enhanced over Israel's 6 decades of existence. Now college students do have a way of growing up, so I don't want to read too much into these anecdotes. But the fact is that a generation whose memories of Israel were shaped by its improbable triumphs in the War of Independence and the Six-Day War is giving way to a generation whose touchstones regarding Israel are the wars in Lebanon and Gaza. Now turning to external threats. In 2009, Israel finds itself confronted by Hamastan to its south and Hezbollah land to its north, both of them allied to and armed by Iran. The West Bank is quiet and considerably more prosperous than it was just a few years ago, but it is still volatile, and the government of Mahmoud Abbas, whose presidential term, I might add, was extended earlier this year without an actual election, is of questionable legitimacy and even more questionable efficacy. It also shows no real signs of coming to terms with Israel on a basis a majority of Israelis can accept. And indeed, Fatah has become more, not less, militant in its approach to Israel. In neighboring Egypt, a succession crisis looms as Hosni Mubarak's health deteriorates, along with Egypt's overall social and economic conditions. It is far from clear that Mr. Mubarak's successor won't be tempted or forced to legalize the Muslim Brotherhood and even bring it into government in order to give the regime the legitimacy it desperately needs. Hence, what happened in Iran 30 years ago, the replacement of an authoritarian but generally pro-American and, in fact, pro-Israel regime, that is to say the Shah, could be replaced by a totalitarian and radically anti-American and anti-Israel regime. That could also happen sometime in the very near future in Israel's largest and most powerful neighbor, that is Egypt. Then there is Iran. Just yesterday, Iran announced that it would begin adding vastly more efficient centrifuges to its enrichment facilities in Natanz. A recent bipartisan report signed by Republican Senator Dan Coates and former Democrat Senator Chuck Robb notes that even with its existing centrifuge capacity, Iran could enrich a bomb's worth of highly enriched uranium, which is the critical component for making an atomic bomb, in less than 2 months, beginning in 2010. That is next year, just a few months away. Iran is moving swiftly to build a secondary route to a nuclear bomb, this one plutonium-based, via its heavy water facility in the city of Arak. If Iran is not stopped from developing these facilities, it will possess the capacity to make nuclear weapons on an industrial scale. On the ballistic missile front, Iran already possesses solid-fueled rockets capable of lobbing a 1-ton weapon as far as Warsaw. There is solid evidence to suggest that it shares and gains technological expertise with North Korea, which has already tested 2 nuclear devices. There is also good evidence of illicit links with China, which a recent investigation by Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau shows has been proliferating missile technologies and materiel to Iran. Russians, too, may also be aiding Iran's nuclear program surreptitiously, even as they have built a civilian nuclear reactor that, after a year of operation, could produce about 330 kilograms of spent fuel, which can easily be reprocessed into weapons-usable plutonium. Just to give you a sense of what 330 kilograms of weapons-usable plutonium is, the plutonium bomb that destroyed Nagasaki had about 5.5 kilograms of plutonium, so you can do the math. Now, as if that were not bad enough, the Kremlin appears intent on providing Iran with a so-called S-300 anti-aircraft missile system, which could render Iran all but impregnable to an Israeli airstrike. All of this is happening at the same time that the West's will to confront Iran forcibly on its nuclear programs is visibly weakening. And even if sanctions were to be imposed, it is less clear that they would have the desired effect of persuading the regime in Iran that Iran's interests are better served by not having a bomb than by having one. Since the election, the Iranian government has become, if anything, more radical and intransigent than it ever was before. The man responsible for perpetrating the bombings of the Jewish Cultural Center in Buenos Aires in the early 1990s is now Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's Minister for Defense. The political opposition, widespread though it is, has been trampled underfoot, and Ahmadinejad's government shows no scruple about cracking down even harder, particularly since the international community has effectively given him a pass and remains willing, indeed eager, to engage him in negotiations that are set to begin next week. Finally, there are the trends of the Arab world itself. It's a curious thing that Israel is threatened both when economic conditions improve in its neighborhood, allowing those neighbors to buy more and better arms and gain greater leverage in the West, as well as when conditions deteriorate as masses of people fall prey to the lure of radical politics. Today, economic conditions are deteriorating. The population of the Arab world is exploding. Since 1980, to take just one example, the population of Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen, has risen from 200,000 to 2 million. That's a 10-fold increase in 30 years. And from a huge pool of unemployed and bored and angry young men, one finds the reserve forces of jihad ready to mobilize against the hated Jewish state. Now, the fourth great challenge that Israel confronts is that of delegitimization. Today, Israel is facing a three-pronged campaign of delegitimization. The first prong, if I may put it that way, comes from the Holocaust deniers. That is, Islamic extremists and fundamentalists who have always rejected Israel's right to exist and typically reject what they believe, wrongly, but that's another story, as the historical basis for Israel's existence, which is the Holocaust. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is only the best-known figure in this campaign, but he's speaking for literally millions of Palestinians, Egyptians, Syrians, Saudis, Jordanians, Malaysians, and European Muslims who are of exactly the same view. These are the people who wish to deny the first Holocaust in order to perpetrate a second Holocaust. I should add, by the way, I just found this just earlier today, that among the people who you might put in the camp of the Holocaust deniers are the European bureaucrats who are currently in charge of UNRWA, the UN's relief and works agency ministering to the Palestinians. The head of the director of operations of UNRWA, who's an Irishman named John Ging, said earlier this month that, quote, "It was inconceivable that the Palestinian students should learn about the Holocaust while Israel has eliminated everything related to Palestine from the curricula of all its books." This is the head of a UN agency explaining why the UNRWA will not put information about the Holocaust in 8th grade Palestinian textbooks. But let's leave the UN for your 26th memorial lecture. Now, the second prong of delegitimization and the bizarre flip side of the first are those who, you might say, affirm the reality of the first Holocaust, but in the process facilitate a second one. These are the people I call the Holocaust Fetishists. What do I mean by that? I mean the people who confuse victimization, whether genuine or perceived, with righteousness, and who look at Jewish powerlessness as a kind of moral ideal that Zionism, as a philosophy of Jewish empowerment, betrays by its very nature. This is seen constantly by the readiness with which Israel's progressive or left-wing critics resort to criticizing the Jewish state, calling Gaza a ghetto or a concentration camp, or calling the 2002 Battle of Jenin a reprise of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It is seen in literary documents, such as the recent play by the well-known British playwright Carol Churchill, who wrote a short play called 7 Jewish Children that purports to tell the story of not only the coarsening, but the Nazification of Jewish ideals from the persecution of the Holocaust to the war in Gaza. And again, I just want to add parenthetically, it was especially depressing to me that when I went to report on the play in a New York City theater, it met with a rapturous response from an overwhelmingly Jewish Lower East Side audience. It's also seen in the increasingly bald comparisons between Israel and apartheid South Africa, played up in books like Jimmy Carter's Peace, Not Apartheid. It is seen in things like last week's Goldstone report, which accuses Israel of crimes against humanity and treats Israel's claims to the right of self-defense with contempt. Finally, the third prong in the campaign of delegitimizing Israel was popularized and given a stamp of intellectual respectability a few years ago by the book The Israel Lobby by University of Chicago professor John Mearsheimer and Harvard's Stephen Walt. This view doesn't quite call for Israel's destruction, but takes the view that Israel is a miscreant state, often working at cross purposes with core American interests, but using hidden levers of power to have the United States do its bidding, the proverbial tail wagging the dog. On this theory, the U.S. would be better served distancing itself from Arab and perhaps severing its alliance entirely in order to curry favor with the Arab world. This is a course that has long been advocated in significant precincts of the State Department, the punditocracy, and among various members of Congress. It could become significantly more influential in the corridors of power in the wake of an Israeli airstrike on Iran that causes a spike in the price of oil or leads to attacks on U.S. installations throughout, military installations throughout the Middle East. One other point is important to make in the matter of legitimacy. Since Israel became a state, some 50 other countries have come into existence in Africa, in Europe, in Central Asia, on the subcontinent, and in South America. Most of these states have been dismal failures, delivering poverty, dictatorship, war, chaos, and even in some cases genocide to their own people. Yet nobody asks whether Burma or Zimbabwe have a right to exist, or whether the creation of Bangladesh was a historical mistake, or whether Serbia ought to be wiped off the map. By contrast, Israel is that rare post-colonial miracle, a functioning, prosperous, pluralistic, liberal democracy. Its contributions to science, technology, the humanities, and popular culture are totally out of proportion to its actual size. And yet Israel is the one state whose right to exist is constantly called into question. Now, why is that? I would argue that the surest path to Israel's destruction is to wonder too deeply about the answer. Jewish survival is not assured by attempting to, quote, understand the motives of those who seek to destroy it or to destroy us, because the lines between understanding and rationalization and sympathy have a way of blurring. But it's also important to point out that, at least in the case of the Jewish state, there is no connection in the eyes of Israel's critics between performance, that is, how well Israel has done as a state, and legitimacy, that is, its right to exist. That means, in my view, that Jews and Israelis make a mistake when they attempt to justify Israel's existential rights by all the good the country has done. We do not spend our lives, our own lives, trying to justify our existence. We merely assert it. The first time I visited Israel when I was a 9-year-old boy, my mother bought me a T-shirt that said simply, "Israel is real." And I remembered that T-shirt, and I think now that there's more wisdom in it than the switching of letters might suggest. Now, having listed the debit side of Israel's ledger, it's worth taking note of some of the assets. David Ben-Gurion famously said that in the Middle East, if you don't believe in miracles, then you're not a realist. I think he was wrong. I think he was wrong about the Middle East, but he was certainly right about Israel. Again, let's go back to demography. In 1950, the Jewish population of Israel stood at about 1 million people. It has increased more than 5-fold. If the United States had experienced similar levels of demographic growth over the same period, we would now be a country of 750 million people. And as I mentioned earlier, Jewish Israelis are alone in the entire Western world in having a robust birth rate. Israel solved a large part of its demographic problem vis-a-vis the Palestinians through its disengagement with Gaza. And while statistics relating to the Israeli Arab population are accurate, the Palestinians' own Census Bureau has almost certainly inflated population figures for political effect. So the demographic trends may be not quite as dire as I might have suggested a little earlier. Now take economics. With barely a drop of oil on its soil, Israel's GDP is $205 billion, or $30,000 per capita. In Saudi Arabia, which is sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, GDP per capita is $20,000. According to a wonderful forthcoming book by my former Jerusalem Post colleague, Saul Singer, and his brother-in-law, Dan Senor, which is called Startup Nation, in 2008, per capita venture capital investments in Israel were 2.5 times greater than in the United States, more than 30 times greater than in Europe, 80 times greater than in China, and 350 times greater than in India. More venture capital flowed in absolute terms to Israel last year than to Germany and France combined. Israel has more companies listed on NASDAQ than any other country save the United States itself. Israeli GDP growth has outpaced the average growth of the rest of the developed world nearly every single year since 1995, 14 years. How has it accomplished all this? Partly, it's a matter of smarter policies that have made Israel an attractive place to work and invest. But as Dan and Saul point out, it's also a function of a culture that stresses flexibility, improvisation, persistence, second chances, informality, argument, skepticism, surprise, and perhaps above all, speed. Now take politics. For all of its inbuilt structural defects, particularly the system which hobbles every government with unwieldy and typically greedy coalition partners, Israeli politics is, for the most part, in a much healthier place than it was in the 1990s. Back then, Israel was a house divided against itself, and the tragic outcome was the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. Today, Israel has once again found its political center of gravity, testified by the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu and Ehud Barak, former bitter political rivals, now work effectively together in a functioning coalition government. This is owed to a number of factors. The first was the discovery by Mr. Barak that the most Israel could offer the Palestinians was less than the minimum the Palestinians were prepared to accept at the Camp David talks of 2000. The second was the realization, following Ariel Sharon's decision to put up the security fence, that Israel's security was better assured having Palestinians on the other side of the fence, on the other side of a border, than on the inside of a border. And the third was the result of disengagement from Gaza, which, despite Hamas's worst intentions, has, in my opinion, made Israel more secure while also telling us something about what Palestinians intend to do with a state of their own. Now take the military. Israel's military is by far the most powerful in the Middle East and probably the most professionally competent army in the world. Its heavily modified F-15s and F-16s outclass everything, or nearly everything, the U.S. Air Force can fly. Israel also has probably the most advanced cyber warfare capability in the world, which is an area of combat that will be to the 21st century what air supremacy was to the 20th century and what naval supremacy was to the 19th and perhaps 18th century. In conversations with me, senior Israeli military officials express a very high level of confidence that they can do devastating damage to Iran's nuclear facilities if called upon to do so. Also in conversations that he had with me and my colleagues at the Wall Street Journal, Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has expressed the same confidence that Israel can, if necessary, get the job done. More importantly, Israel has a military culture that studies and learns from its mistakes. The war in Gaza was a success, at least tactically speaking, because Israel had the Winograd Commission. Similarly with intelligence, how is it, one wonders, that someone was able to place a bomb in the headrest of Hezbollah mastermind Imad Mughniya's car in a heavily guarded neighborhood in Damascus? How is it that key Iranian weapons of mass destruction scientists keep dying in very mysterious circumstances? Why did Iran's only AWACS airborne radar plane just crash the day before yesterday? I'm just asking. Now, another area of strength for Israel is the enemies, is the weakness of its enemies. Where Israel has a culture of self-examination, its enemies have a culture of shame and honor. Such cultures can be beautiful and they can be exotic, but they also tend to be fanatical, violent, deceptive and self-deceptive, and incapable of making adjustments in the face of reality. This makes them extremely brittle and susceptible to sudden cracks. The upshot is that while Israelis are always making and solving their mistakes, Israel's neighbors are storing up mistakes until they finally become catastrophe. We've seen this, historically speaking, in every fight Israel's neighbors have picked with it. Overconfidence on the part of Israel's enemies has typically bred failure. We're seeing it again today with Al-Qaeda and other jihadi groups. Not content with murdering infidels, They turned their terrorism on other Muslims and are now being shunned in Ramadi and hunted down in Pakistan's Swat Valley. And we may be seeing it also with Iran. The elections in June demonstrated to Iran's people, most of all, the moral bankruptcy of their leaders. Even the Shiite religious establishment has largely turned against Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's regimes, and his tactics have united Iran's fractured opposition groups into a broad social movement, not unlike the Solidarity movement that over a decade succeeded in toppling communist rule in Poland in the 1980s. The Iranian economy is getting no better. Inflation runs about 25%, youth unemployment is sky high, and negative social indicators like drug addiction and prostitution are on the rise. This is a regime waiting to be kicked over the edge. And finally, tallying Israel's strength, let's go back to the subject of Zionism. In 2006, Israel mobilized its reserves for the war in Lebanon. I was there at the time. Astonishingly, the call-up rate was more than 100%. That is, people too old to serve or people living abroad made it a point of coming back to the country in order to fight for it. It's hard to imagine anywhere else in the world where something similar could happen. Now, having tallied, as I see them, the assets as well as the liabilities, how are we to make sense of this? The question remains, will Israel survive? Let me offer you a very Israeli answer to that question. The answer would be, it's dependent. I see three things that Israelis and Jews need to do. Number one, get the sequencing right. The paradox of Israeli life is that it exists in two very different kinds of time. One is nanosecond time, the nanosecond reactions to terrorist attacks, the nanosecond speeds of Israeli-designed microprocessors, the nanosecond decision of putting a bomb on a target. The second kind of time is historical time, which in the Middle East is generational time, millennial time, you might even say even geological time. And there is a temptation to want to apply the first measure of time to the second. That is to resolve all problems now, immediately, when those problems may be operating according to a very different timetable, a very different logic, a very different schedule. Now, in order to address the long-term challenges to Israel's existence, it seems to me that Israel first has to survive its most immediate threats. Typically, left-wing Israelis often make the point that unless Israel addresses the demographic time bomb by implementing a two-state solution, it will eventually self-destruct as a Jewish and democratic state. This point is inarguable. Israel needs a two-state solution, something even Benjamin Netanyahu has come to recognize. But it is equally inarguable that this time bomb isn't going to detonate for another 20 or 30 years. And there is a big difference between a two-state solution in theory and a two-state solution in practice. Right now, in practice, the only way Israel is going to get two states on terms that are acceptable to a majority of Israelis is through a second disengagement, in which Israel withdraws to borders it decides on, and on terms the current crop of Palestinian leaders are sure to reject. This means no peace treaty, and it creates conditions that would be ripe for Hamas to exploit, just as they did in Gaza. And it's entirely clear to me that it is in Israel's interests, it's not entirely clear to me, in fact, it's not at all clear to me, that it is in any way in Israel's interest to allow that to happen, especially not when Hamas grows ever more closely allied with the regime in Tehran. So Israel is vastly better served by delaying the two-state solution and going for interim steps instead until such a time when conditions in the neighborhood improve. And no single force contributes more to the deterioration of political conditions in the region than Iran. It does so through its support for Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, and militant groups in Iraq, both Sunni and Shiite. It does so by its interference in the politics of Egypt and Lebanon and the Persian Gulf. And its ability to make mischief will only be turbocharged by possession of a nuclear arsenal. So, stopping Iran in its nuclear bid is the sine qua non of Israel's survival, not just because of the immediate threat it would pose, because the immediate threat it would pose to Israel is so grave, but because it would prevent Israel from being able to address all of its long-term challenges 5, 10, 15, and 20 years down the road. Secondly, make a better case for Israel, or make the case for Israel better. Eric Hoffer, the great longshoreman and 20th century philosopher, said many years ago that Israel is the only country in the world expected to behave like a nation of Christian gentlemen. To an extent that is depressing to acknowledge, Israel will always be hated for what it is, no matter what it does. This is the reality of Jewish history, the burden of Jewish fate. In every generation, they rise up against us to destroy us. But none of this means that Israel is fated to lose the battle of hearts and minds among fair-minded people who, from one generation to the next, must learn anew what the case for Israel is. Today, the case that most urgently needs to be made for Israel is the liberal case. As a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, it is very easy for me and natural to me to make a right-of-center case for Israel. Throughout America, Christian Zionists are making a powerful Christian case for Israel. For all of our mishugas, Jews, broadly speaking, can make, of course, the Jewish case for Israel. But what is the liberal case for Israel? I often go to college campuses where I address audiences very unlike this one, audiences of very young people, not all of them, or not even a majority of them Jewish, many of them non-committal about Israel, and many of them also hostile, at least in a kind of vague sense, but hostile to Israel. And I always put the following case to them. I ask them, these young kids, I say, how many of you are for gay rights? All hands go up. I say, great. How many of you think that gays should serve in the military? Should be allowed to serve in the military openly? All hands go up. Terrific. Then I ask, how many of you feel that women are as entitled to every single choice and opportunity as a man is in society? How many of you believe in women's rights in the broadest sense? All hands go up. Metsuyan, Yofi, it's wonderful. Then I say, how many of you think that if you're an artist, one of your rights is the right to offend the sensibilities of your audience? All hands go up. How many of you think that if you're a politician and you've committed a crime, say you've embezzled money, or say you've sexually harassed one of your employees, how many of you think that you should be prosecuted by the law, if necessary, through criminal charges? All hands go up. How many of you think that if you're accused of a crime, you have a right to a decent, impartial jury and judge and trial and appeal if necessary? All hands go up. How many of you are opposed to the death penalty? Most hands go up. Now, having laid all of that out, I turn to these kids and I say, terrific. The only country in the Middle East that has applied precisely the values I have described consistently and ever more broadly is Israel. It is not Palestine, where gay Palestinians flee for their lives and wind up on the streets of South Tel Aviv. It is not Jordan or Egypt, where honor killings of women are endemic. It is not Iran, which has, after China, the highest execution rate in the world. It is not Egypt, which has lived under the emergency orders of a military regime for the past 28 years. The only country that espouses the values that you have just professed to me through your votes are your own is Israel. So, before you criticize Israel, Before you call it an apartheid state, ignoring the 120,000 Ethiopian Africans who are Jews, or the 75,000 Indians, or the 2 million Sephardic Jews, before you do that, tell me, by all means criticize Israel, but don't do so from the standpoint of a hypocrite to your own values. That, to me, seems to me the case that urgently needs to be made for Israel now, urgently needs to be made among your children or your grandchildren on college campuses, and if we can make that case effectively, we will have won over a new generation to this cause, to this country. Now, finally, I want to conclude by talking about what I think is the most essential ingredient to Israel's survival, and that is Jewish loyalty. It is the answer to the sociological problems that confront Israel today, the splits between the Haredi communities or the ultra-Orthodox communities and the more secular communities, between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazis, between Israel and the diaspora. Now, what do I mean by loyalty? I do not mean, as so many anti-Semites and Israel bashers suggest, a loyalty that supersedes the obligations we owe America legally and morally and emotionally. On the contrary, it is precisely because the state of Israel and the law of return gives each of us, at least those of us in this room who are Jews, the right to be citizens of Israel, that we have to honor the choice we have made by remaining citizens of the United States. At the same time, I do not mean by loyalty a kind of loyalty limited only to, quote, our kind of Jew, religious or secular, right-wing or left-wing. It is this kind of narrow Jewish loyalty that has led to some of the worst betrayals in Jewish history, from the disloyalty of Bar Kamsa that led to the destruction of the Second Temple, to the disloyalty of a right-wing fanatic named Yigal Amir that led to the murder of Yitzhak Rabin, to the left-wing disloyalty of people like Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein, who traffic on their Jewishness in order to promote arguments and agendas that give aid and comfort to Israel's worst enemies. Rather, what I mean by loyalty is the loyalty of a warm breast, a sense of decent respect and affection, that I feel toward every Jew, whether he shares my notions of observance or not, whether he shares my politics or not. It is the kind of loyalty that allows me to argue till I'm blue in the face, but not get up and leave the table. It is the loyalty that requires me to listen to what others have to say. It is the loyalty the loyalty that propels me to extend a hand when I'm tempted to recoil in anger. It is the loyalty that makes me contribute to Jewish causes, providing aid and comfort to Jews in need. It is the loyalty I owe to my grandmother and my mother as they held fast to a faith through the darkness of the Holocaust in Europe, and to my cousins in Israel who send their children to war while I opine upon the tactics of the Israeli military from the safety of my office at the Wall Street Journal. It is the loyalty that reminds us that the core of Jewish faith is that I am my brother's keeper, even if I might sometimes be his critic. The loyalty that led Esau to embrace his brother Jacob, and Joseph to forgive his brothers. It is the loyalty we owe Israel. It is the loyalty Israels owe each other, and above all, it is the loyalty we owe ourselves. You have done me a great honor by asking me to be your speaker for the 25th Memorial Harold Hoffman Lecture. Thank you for listening to me so attentively. Thank you, Rabbi. Yes. It is the case that Israel is more united politically today because Israelis from pretty much, not the very far left, but certainly from the mainstream left to the right, understand that Palestinian politics today is nowhere close to where it needs to be in order to achieve a lasting peace. And my advice to Israelis on the subject of a Palestinian state is the same advice that sailors used to tattoo on their hands when they go up on the yard arms on square-rigged ships. They would tattoo HOLDFAST, hold fast. It is, I think, the fact is that today Fatah is more extreme than it has been. Mohammed Dakhlan, one of Arafat's closest lieutenants and now a senior person in Fatah, said explicitly that Fatah never recognized Israel's right to exist. Fatah never recognized the Oslo Accords. And it is foolish, I don't think Israelis are going to do this, but it is foolish on the part of anyone to imagine that it is wise to offer at this moment a state to a national movement that is less concerned with building its own nation than it is with destroying another. It continues to be, the Palestinian national movement, very much the child of Yasser Arafat. That's a tragedy for Israel. It's a tragedy for Palestinians too. On the second point, yes, little Satan and great Satan, they want to destroy us both. And we are foolish to imagine that Iran does not have global ambitions. Look, a point that is often argued in Council on Foreign Relations type places, they say, well, look, Iran is fundamentally a rational actor. They know that Israel is sitting on a large stockpile of nuclear weapons. They're not about to strike Israel. They're not about to start World War III or IV, whatever you want to call it. But let me sort of put this to this audience. In 1914, the Germany that invaded France was a nasty authoritarian country. But it was not hell-bent on reshaping the face of the world. It wanted to adjust its borders in Europe. It wanted more colonial possessions in Africa and the Pacific and where else. But it didn't want to reshape the world. There were Jews who fought in the Kaiser's armies. Okay? The Germany that invaded France in 1940 was a very different kind of Germany. It wanted to reshape the face of the world, literally reshape the face of the world in its own demonic, racialist, Aryan image. It was not a national, it was not simply, this wasn't Germany simply as a nation state adding to its prerogatives in the way that nation states do. This was a revolutionary movement that had global ambitions. We've seen those kinds of movements in the past. Napoleonic France was one, Nazi Germany was another, Soviet Russia was a third, and I would argue that Iran, if you attend to what they say and attend to what they do and how they do it, they see themselves as a vanguard of a revolutionary Islamic movement that intends to reshape first the Islamic world, but then the world entirely according to its own dictates. And possessing a nuclear weapon is a key ingredient in that ambition. It's important to understand what Iran is. Iran is not a country, it's a cause, and it's a malign cause. So that's a kind of extended way of answering the gentleman's question.
Well, I have two more questions. It's interesting that we've been here for almost an hour and a half, let's say, in September of 2009, and the word settlements has not come up yet. And I think it has to come up.
Okay.
Not long response, but what do you see the role of that issue in this current situation? Is it something that the administration is just trying to use to show the Arab world that it can pressure Israel? Is it a real issue?
I'm glad you asked the question. Look, there's a lot not to like about the settlements. And to speak very plainly, there's a lot not to like about many of the settlers. There is among, not all, not even a majority, but among some settler communities, militancy, anger, not only contempt for Palestinians, but a militant contempt, a contempt for Israeli law, that does Israel no justice, okay? That said, I wish settlements were the problem. Now let me explain what I mean by that. If Israel merely had a territorial dispute with its neighbors, with the Palestinians, then you could make the argument, well, if you've got a territorial dispute, adjust the borders, move people around. By all means, 54-40 or fight, okay, you want to draw the latitude or here, there, whatever, move the borders around. The conflict would have been resolved a long time ago if Israel merely had a territorial dispute. Everything that has happened from 1993 onwards has shown that Israel does not have a territorial dispute. It has an existential dispute. The issue, in other words, is not 1967. The issue is 1948. It's not the borders of Israel, it's the existence of Israel. Okay? So it's very easy, okay, to go to some settlement community and say, these guys are whack jobs, right? I mean, look, they're putting their children in harm's way. They're living in the middle of the Gaza Strip, and secular kids from Tel Aviv have to go to these godforsaken settlements and live in fear of their lives for 3 months at a time because 200 settlers want to live in this place with only a theoretical connection with Jewish history or a partial connection to Jewish history. I'm talking about Gaza. I'm not talking about Hebron or Shem or these places. Okay. This is a problem, and it's normal that Israelis said, something, this is not really what we want to send our children off to die for. That being said, okay, settlements are not the core of the problem. You can remove all the settlements you want, you can expand settlements, you can do whatever you want to do, but that will not resolve the problem. What will resolve the problem is if you get someone like King Hussein, of the late King Hussein of Jordan, who at some level was enough of a gentleman or a realist to say, enough of this. I do not want to be the next Saladin. I simply want to be the president of a little state in the Middle East which intends to be normal and prosperous and deliver better benefits for my people the way that, say, Belgium. No, that's a terrible example. The way that, say, Costa Rica does. Terrific. When that leadership appears, the problem will be settled in weeks. Until that leadership appears, the problem will never be settled, no matter how many settlers are removed. When the book The Israel Lobby came out, I mean, it was an embarrassment on a whole number of, it was an offense, but it was also an embarrassment. It was an embarrassment. I'm a graduate of the University of Chicago, and intellectually speaking, I was embarrassed by the caliber of its thinking. The misuse of quotations, including quoting me, but all kinds of stuff. But the stupidest thing about the book, okay, is that it speaks of the Israel lobby as if the Israel lobby consists of, say, AIPAC, ADL, a couple of other organizations that, are just all powerful. American support for Israel is not the product of a lobby, although that lobby does its work and good work for the most part on discrete legislative points, like any other kind of lobby does. But typically the most powerful lobbies in America, like the AARP or other lobbies, it's not that they represent some narrow point of view. They represent something that you might call an American consensus. Now, whether you're a liberal or a conservative in this room, you voted for McCain, you voted for Bush, I bet none of you, okay, believes that the United States should immediately withdraw from the NATO military organization. Why? Because all Americans think it's pretty much a good idea that we should be in NATO. Sure, there might be some crackpots on the margins who say no to NATO. I bet none of you, whether you're Republican or Democrat, believes that, government has zero role in supporting the widow and the orphan, okay? There's a role of social support. Now, whether you believe it should be at the $1 trillion or $10 trillion level, I have my views. But there are, on a whole number of issues, there's an American consensus. Support for Israel happens to be a core American consensus position. Consistently since the moment of its founding in 1948, a wide majority of Americans have basically looked at this country and said, yeah, good guys, they're kind of like us, we're for them. It's a Joe Sixpack position, but it's a very real position. It's not just a Joe Sixpack position. Zionism, as an idea, was present before the Revolutionary War. When George Washington sent that wonderful letter to a temple in Newport, Rhode Island, he said, it is no longer a mere toleration that we speak of. You know, there was the attitude towards Jews. You know, not far from here, there's Yale University with its look at the insignia of the place. James Madison had to go take an extra year at Princeton because he flunked his Hebrew classes. Anyway, this kind of belief in Zionism, this kind of emphasis on the Old Testament, is deeply a part of the American story, going back before 1948, and has become more so now. So when you talk about the American-Israeli relationship, it's not because, you know, a bunch of machers like Malcolm Hoenlein, or, you know, yeah, I like Malcolm, he's a great guy, he does good work, but, you know, 5 guys in a room are sitting together and saying, right, folks, you know, let's you know, grease the skids on the latest sale of weapons to Israel. When Mearsheimer and Walt wrote about this, they said, the entire media is in the tank for Israel. Both the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal and the editorial pages of the New York Times are all pro-Israel. Like, I mean, what do I have in common with Abe Rosenthal, you know, the editor, you know, Maureen Dowd, Gail Collins, these people, you know, nothing. Well, I mean, what we have in common is there are some bedrock values, and among them is support for Israel, because in Israel we find a reflection of our values, our ambitions, our sense of a heroic country and a heroic destiny. So that is the nature of that relationship. Can I make one tiny last point? Okay. Okay.
We have full mid-range in about 5 minutes.
Okay. Look, I've served you some pretty thick broth tonight, and I don't want you to be totally depressed. So I want to tell you a story, kind of like the story I began this speech with. It's a wonderful book by James Clavell, who wrote these big pot boilers, Taipan, Shogun. He wrote a book that was mainly a memoir called King Rat, based on his experiences as a Japanese prisoner of war. It was made into a good film. And in the book, he relates, or one of the characters relates his experience as a British Air Force pilot who was shot down over what were then the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia today, during the Second World War. So he's shot down over some jungle in Japanese-occupied territory, but he's taken in by a friendly, very, very primitive, but friendly tribe. And so, of course, he's grateful for their hospitality, and he's brought to the hut of the chief of the tribe. And it's incredibly primitive, thatched roofs, no electricity, no running water, you know, dirt floors. And there, in the middle of this hut, there's a toilet bowl. It's not connected to anything, it's just a porcelain toilet bowl in the middle of the hut. Okay. Doesn't want to say anything, doesn't want to offend the chief. But after, you know, he's there for a while, he gets a bit friendlier, and he says, Chief, I'm just kind of curious, why do you have this toilet bowl there? She says, I don't know, it kind of just amuses me when, you know, people are like, why is this toilet bowl there? Now, why am I talking about this? You may wonder. A toilet is a very interesting thing. What you see is just a bowl, basically, on a stand. But a toilet is connected invisibly to pipes, which are connected to a sewage system, which is maintained by engineers and plumbers, which has to be then fed by reservoirs and has to be incorporated in some notions of hygiene, which actually express the highest values of Western civilization. Not long ago, I was in Dubai. You'll see there's a connection here. Okay. And in Dubai, they're building the tallest building in the world. It's incredible. It's twice the height of the Empire State Building. I think it's 26 or 2,800 feet high. And you go and you're like, wow, that's amazing. Look at the height of that building. And of course, there's tons of stuff in Dubai, these artificial islands, these indoor ski slopes, all in the desert. You think, oh, this is very impressive. But if you actually stop to think, you think, that building, that skyscraper, was designed by architects in Chicago, and it was planned and engineered in Frankfurt. And the guys who are actually up there on the scaffolding building it are from Bangladesh. What is the Dubai content in this very impressive skyscraper? 0. It's like a toilet bowl in the hut of the chieftain in the middle of the jungle in World War II era Indonesia. Now you go to Israel, okay? You look around, small country, you look at the irrigation, you say, it's green over there. Why is it green? Because Israelis made it green. There are trees on that hill. Why are there trees? Because Israelis planted it. Tel Aviv cityscape is completely changed from 25 years. Why is that? Because it's an Israeli capital, Israeli investment, typically Israeli architects as well. You drive up the road to Herzliya, you go by these high-tech firms. It says Intel, Microsoft, and so on. But what's interesting about Intel and Microsoft isn't that these are American companies that are just putting headquarters in Israel because the taxes are low. I wish they were low. It's because they have to come to Israel to figure out how to make a better microprocessor and a better search engine. And so they come and find people in the Technion and at the Weizmann Institute and Hebrew University and so on. The point I'm making is that, if you will, Israel, the toilet, is connected to stuff underneath, and that is known as human capital. And that suggests a kind of vitality, a strength, a depth, a rootedness that exists nowhere else in the Middle East. That says to me that in 100 years' time, when my when my children are very old or their children are middle-aged, in 100 years' time, there will be this little country, Israel, founded on solid bedrock, and all of these kingdoms in the sand with their ferocity and their fanaticism and lunatic hatreds and lunatic ideas will be just swept away in the dust that is around them. Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.